The heat lingered even after the war had ended. In a quiet residential district on the outskirts of Tokyo, the sound of insects carried through streets flattened into ash and splintered wood. Roofs were gone. Windows shattered. What remained were people, and waiting. Japanese civilian women stood beside cracked hand pumps and dry wells, holding metal buckets that had not been filled in weeks. The city's water system had been shattered by months of bombing. Pipes lay broken beneath the rubble. Rivers nearby were polluted with debris and disease. For many families, clean water had become more precious than food. Children sat silently in the shade. Elderly parents leaned against walls blackened by fire. The women watched the road, not with hope, but with caution. American vehicles had been seen passing through since the surrender. They were the enemy who had won. No one knew what their presence would mean. Then the trucks stopped. Uniformed American soldiers stepped down, not with rifles raised, but with containers. Large metal tanks. Hoses. Cups. One soldier turned a valve. Clear water spilled out, catching the sunlight as it struck the dust. The women did not move at first. They stared, stunned, not at the soldiers, but at the water itself. And in that moment, the meaning of defeat began to change. By the summer of 1945, Japan's home front had already been defeated long before the formal surrender was signed. From late 1944 onward, the war had moved decisively against the Japanese mainland. American strategic bombing intensified as U.S. forces captured island bases close enough to launch sustained air campaigns. The introduction of B-29 superfortress raids changed the scale of destruction entirely. Cities that had stood for centuries, built largely of wood and paper, were now vulnerable in ways no previous war had revealed. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, Tokyo experienced the deadliest air raid in human history. Incendiary bombs ignited firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Over 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. 1 million were left homeless. Water mains melted underground. Pump stations burned. Rivers filled with debris, fuel, and bodies. What remained of the city's water infrastructure was fractured beyond repair. Similar scenes unfolded across Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities. By July 1945, more than 60 Japanese urban centers had been heavily bombed. Civil defense systems collapsed. Sanitation vanished. Wells were contaminated by ash and sewage. Dysentery and typhoid spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters. In this environment, civilian survival depended largely on women. With millions of men conscripted, killed, or stationed far from home, Japanese women carried the burden of daily life. They stood in ration lines. They scavenged ruins for usable materials. They cared for children, the wounded, and the elderly. Water collection became one of their most dangerous and exhausting tasks. Many walked miles to rivers or broken pipes, risking disease with every bucket drawn. The Japanese government, once tightly controlled and militarized, was no longer capable of providing relief. Transportation networks were destroyed. Fuel was non-existent. Medical supplies were nearly gone. By August 1945, Japan's civilian population faced starvation, dehydration, and epidemic disease. The surrender announcement on August 15 brought an end to organized fighting, but it did not immediately improve conditions on the ground. In many areas, nothing changed at all. Cities were still ruins. Wells were still dry. Clean water was still absent. Fear replaced exhaustion. Rumors spread quickly. Civilians had been warned for years that American soldiers were brutal, vengeful, and violent. Propaganda had portrayed them as inhuman. Many Japanese women were told to expect abuse, humiliation, or death at the hands of occupying forces. Some communities prepared for the worst, hiding daughters and burning documents. Yet beneath that fear was another reality. Survival was no longer possible without outside help. American planners were already aware of the scale of the crisis. Intelligence reports compiled during the final months of the war warned of widespread disease outbreaks if Japan's infrastructure was not immediately stabilized. Water was identified as the most urgent priority, not as a gesture of kindness, but as a matter of control, public health, and long-term occupation strategy. When the first American troops entered civilian districts, they were not stepping into a functioning society. They were stepping into a vacuum. And it was within that vacuum that one simple act, offering clean water, would carry a meaning far beyond logistics. Long before the first American boots touched Japanese soil, the humanitarian crisis had already been calculated. By early 1945, U.S. military planners understood that Japan's defeat would not resemble Germany's. The country's geography, its dense urban populations, and the extent of bombing damage pointed toward a civilian catastrophe unlike anything Allied forces had previously managed. Intelligence assessments compiled by the Office of Strategic Services and the War Department warned of mass disease outbreaks within weeks of surrender if sanitation and clean water were not immediately restored. Water was not viewed as a symbolic gesture. It was a strategic necessity. The collapse of Japan's municipal systems meant that even cities spared from atomic attack faced biological danger. Contaminated water had historically killed more civilians than bombs in post-conflict zones. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were already present in several regions by August 1945. Medical officers knew that without intervention, occupation forces themselves would also be at risk. As a result, the transition from war to occupation was planned with unusual speed. Operation Blacklist, the Allied occupation plan for Japan, outlined immediate priorities: disarmament, food distribution, medical stabilization, and water purification. U.S. Army engineers, Navy Seabees, and medical units were assigned to assess damaged infrastructure within days of landing. Portable purification systems, chlorination tablets, tanker trucks, and mobile pumps were prepared in advance. Unlike earlier campaigns, these units were instructed to enter civilian spaces directly. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, emphasized order without revenge. His directives stressed discipline, restraint, and visibility. American soldiers were not to loot, not to intimidate, not to retaliate. This was not only moral policy, it was psychological strategy. A population that feared occupation could not be governed. A population struggling for water could not be stabilized. For Japanese civilians, especially women, none of this planning was visible. What they saw instead were foreign uniforms moving through streets once filled with fire. They saw trucks rolling past bombed homes. They heard unfamiliar voices speaking calmly, without shouting. The expectation was violence. The reality, at least in those first encounters, was confusion. Water distribution often began quietly. In many districts, American units identified damaged wells or public pumps and established temporary water points. Engineers tested sources. Medics oversaw chlorination. Soldiers guarded distribution not to control civilians, but to prevent panic. Clean water was dispensed in measured quantities, sometimes poured directly into household containers. Women were almost always the first to approach. They were the ones responsible for keeping families alive. They understood the difference between clear water and safe water. Some hesitated, waiting for instruction. Others bowed instinctively, unsure of the rules. The soldiers, many barely older than the women themselves, followed their orders, handing over water, explaining through gestures, moving on. Occupation reports from late August and September 1945 repeatedly note civilian astonishment at the absence of abuse. There were no shouted commands. No punishments. No demands for payment. In several documented cases, American medics refused to distribute water until it could be properly treated, despite civilian desperation, an act that puzzled many Japanese observers, accustomed to scarcity and compromise. For women who had spent years rationing every drop, the idea that an enemy would delay distribution to ensure safety was incomprehensible. This was not generosity in the emotional sense. It was procedural, methodical, almost indifferent. And yet, it carried immense emotional weight. Because for the first time since the war began, survival was not being demanded, it was being provided. The water itself became a symbol of something larger: control without cruelty, victory without chaos, a future that did not require fear at every encounter. And as distribution expanded beyond emergency points into neighborhoods and shelters, the reaction of Japanese civilian women revealed something no intelligence report could fully predict. Defeat, it turned out, did not always arrive with humiliation. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, through a cup of clean water, offered without words. Angle 1. The human burden carried by women. In the final year of the war, Japanese civilian women had become the invisible infrastructure of survival. They were not only mothers and daughters. They were water carriers, nurses, laborers, and caretakers in cities stripped of basic systems. With men absent or lost, women organized daily life around scarcity. Every routine, cooking, cleaning, caring for the sick, required water that no longer flowed. Many walked long distances to rivers fouled by ash and debris. Others collected rainwater in broken cookware. Buckets were reused without cleaning. Children drank from sources that had once been industrial drains. Women understood the risks but had no alternatives. When American water points appeared, the response was not immediate gratitude. It was calculation. Women inspected the water. They watched the process. They noticed soldiers testing sources, discarding containers, insisting on order. This behavior contradicted years of propaganda that had described Americans as reckless or cruel. The shock was quiet but profound. For women responsible for family survival, trust could not be symbolic, it had to be proven. Water was proof. Angle 2. The medical reality behind the gesture. From a medical standpoint, the situation was approaching catastrophe. U.S. Army medical officers documented rising cases of dysentery, particularly among children and the elderly. Dehydration compounded malnutrition. In some shelters, entire families shared a single contaminated source. Epidemic modeling conducted after the war confirmed that without rapid intervention, disease would have spread uncontrollably through urban centers. Clean water distribution was therefore a frontline defense. American units treated water before distribution, often chlorinating even when it delayed access. To civilians accustomed to compromise, this insistence seemed unnecessary. But medical doctrine was clear. One contaminated source could undo weeks of progress. Women, often the first to notice changes in children's health, began to see results. Fewer fevers. Fewer stomach illnesses. Infants survived days they would not have weeks earlier. These outcomes spread by observation, not rumor. Trust grew not through words, but through survival. Angle 3. Psychological shock from an unexpected enemy. Perhaps the most powerful impact was psychological. Japanese wartime conditioning had framed surrender as shameful and occupation as brutal. Women, in particular, were warned of humiliation. Some communities had prepared for self-harm rather than capture. Against that expectation, the reality of calm, structured aid created cognitive dissonance. American soldiers did not celebrate victory in civilian spaces. They did not display dominance through cruelty. Instead, they enforced routines, lines, measurements, sanitation rules. This approach removed fear by replacing chaos with predictability. For women who had lived through years of air raids, predictability was revolutionary. The offering of water was not interpreted as charity. It was interpreted as control. And that, paradoxically, brought relief. A controlled environment meant safety. It meant tomorrow could be planned. In that shift, from fear to cautious stability, the emotional center of occupation began to form. And beyond the human and psychological impact lay another dimension: the systems and leadership that made such restraint possible. Angle 4. Logistics as power, not punishment. Behind every cup of clean water stood an immense logistical machine. The U.S. military had learned hard lessons in earlier campaigns. In North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific Islands, disease had incapacitated armies faster than enemy fire. By 1945, sanitation and water purification were no longer secondary concerns, they were core military doctrine. In Japan, this doctrine was applied on an unprecedented civilian scale. Engineer units assessed damaged municipal systems block by block. Portable purification plants, capable of treating thousands of gallons a day, were deployed near rivers and reservoirs. Tanker trucks moved through shattered streets, delivering water where pipes no longer existed. Chlorination levels were carefully monitored. Records were kept. This was not improvisation. It was systems thinking. For Japanese women watching this process, the scale itself was shocking. Scarcity had defined their wartime existence. Now they were witnessing abundance controlled by discipline. Water was not begged for or bartered, it was scheduled, measured, and distributed. This approach communicated authority without violence. The message was implicit but unmistakable. The Americans controlled not only weapons, but survival itself. Angle 5. Leadership and occupation policy. The restraint displayed on the ground reflected decisions made at the highest levels. General MacArthur's occupation policy emphasized stability over retribution. Unlike in some earlier historical occupations, Japanese civilians were not treated as conquered enemies to be punished, but as a population to be governed. This distinction shaped every directive given to soldiers. Strict discipline was enforced. Any mistreatment of civilians risked court-martial. Fraternization was regulated. Aid was separated from political messaging. The goal was legitimacy, not gratitude. Water distribution fit squarely into this framework. By preventing disease, the occupation reduced unrest. By assisting women, the central figures of household survival, the Americans indirectly stabilized entire communities. Leadership understood that women's daily routines shaped civilian morale more than official proclamations. Occupation reports repeatedly note that when women accepted aid calmly, wider resistance diminished. Angle 6. The moral dimension of victory. There was also an unspoken moral contrast unfolding. Japan's wartime ideology had glorified sacrifice and endurance, often at the expense of civilian welfare. By contrast, the American approach emphasized preservation of life, even among former enemies. This difference was not debated, it was observed. For Japanese women who had lost homes, children, or husbands, moral clarity did not come from speeches. It came from actions repeated daily. Clean water delivered consistently. Without threats. Without humiliation. Victory expressed through restraint carried its own weight. And as these systems expanded from isolated points into organized networks, one moment would crystallize everything, when relief shifted from emergency response to permanent change. That moment would mark the true turning point of occupation. By late August 1945, American forces were moving systematically into urban districts of Japan. The surrender had ended active combat, but the devastation on the ground was immediate and overwhelming. Civilians remained without basic necessities. The cities, once crowded with life, were quiet, scorched, and fractured. In one district of Yokohama, women lined the streets, buckets and containers in hand. Children clung to skirts, their eyes wide with war-born caution. American trucks rolled through, tanks of water secured on flatbeds, soldiers moving efficiently to set up temporary distribution points. Hoses snaked into portable taps, valves adjusted carefully to prevent spills. Every detail was deliberate, documented, precise. At first, the women did not approach. Decades of warnings about enemy cruelty had conditioned them to distrust. But the soldiers waited. They gestured calmly, pointing to the containers. Medical officers inspected water quality. Engineers double-checked chlorination. The silence was not threatening, but incomprehensible. The expected intimidation never came. Then the first cups were filled. A young mother stepped forward, her bucket trembling. She took water from a soldier who held it steadily, nodding without words. She returned to her child, her hands shaking as she poured water into a tin cup. The child drank, eyes wide, and then a small, tentative smile appeared. Behind them, other women followed. One by one, skepticism gave way to cautious acceptance. Observers recorded the scene, astonishment mixed with relief. Women bent low over their containers, inhaling the coolness, touching the clear liquid as if to confirm its reality. This simple act, hands meeting water, was a moment of profound human recalibration. Fear began to soften. Hope, a concept long abandoned, resurfaced quietly. American soldiers moved among them with deliberate calm. No barking commands. No gestures of dominance. Their presence was not oppressive, but methodical. They checked buckets, adjusted taps, and maintained lines to prevent crowding. For women accustomed to scarcity, the very order of this process was shocking. It communicated safety, reliability, and respect, elements entirely absent from years of war. The first reports filtered back to command posts. Engineers and medical officers noted civilian reactions in detailed logs. Women observed carefully before touching water, children hesitant, general expressions of disbelief, no panic. The understated language belied the magnitude of the moment. This was not mere distribution, it was the demonstration of control without coercion. As the sun moved westward over Yokohama, water points expanded. Trucks moved to neighboring streets, portable pumps set up near wells previously deemed unusable. The scale of the operation grew, but the core dynamic remained. Civilians approaching, touching, and drinking clean water for the first time in months, sometimes years. Every act reinforced the reality of the American presence, not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as facilitators of survival. In homes and shelters, news spread rapidly. Women who had been hesitant sent messages to neighbors, "Water is safe. Soldiers do not harm." This was unprecedented. Within hours, the rhythm of civilian life began to shift, not through orders, but through observation. The first turning point had arrived. The psychological and physical impact was immediate. Disease risks were mitigated. Children drank safely. Elderly women regained energy sufficient for essential tasks. But beyond the practical effects, something more profound occurred, a redefinition of enemy, authority, and survival. For Japanese civilian women, the understanding that defeat need not be cruel was beginning to take root. As September 1945 progressed, water distribution transformed from isolated interventions into a systematic operation across cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima. American units deployed in waves, pairing engineering detachments with medical teams. Water purification plants operated 24 hours a day, producing thousands of gallons. Tanker trucks navigated destroyed streets, bypassing rubble and collapsed bridges. Portable taps were set up in neighborhoods, shelters, and near communal kitchens. The operation became a visible symbol of occupation authority executed with restraint. Japanese civilian women, initially cautious, now observed the growing network with a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. Reports from civil affairs officers noted that women were often the first to arrive at distribution points, assessing water clarity, container hygiene, and quantity before allowing children or elderly family members to drink. Their actions demonstrated not only vigilance but a deep understanding of survival logic shaped by years of scarcity. The reactions went beyond relief. Many women were struck by the contrast between expectation and reality. Years of war, propaganda, and fear had conditioned them to assume that surrender meant humiliation or worse. Instead, they encountered patience, order, and discipline. Soldiers supervised without dominance, enforced hygiene without harshness, and ensured equitable access without favoritism. The psychological impact was profound. Women began to perceive the Americans not as indiscriminate conquerors but as a force capable of structured, predictable mercy. Medical teams recorded immediate improvements in public health. Dysentery and typhoid cases began to stabilize in districts where clean water was consistently available. Children regained weight and energy. Mortality among the elderly decreased. Beyond physical health, this progress fostered social stability. Families could plan meals and chores, easing the burden on women who had been stretched to exhaustion. For the first time in months, there was a measure of predictability. The moral weight of the occupation became apparent in these moments. By enabling survival without coercion, Americans reinforced their authority and demonstrated a model of governance based on restraint. Japanese women, often at the heart of domestic life, became conduits for this message. They shared information, organized neighbors, and observed that compliance with occupation rules was accompanied not by punishment but by benefit. The lessons of survival intertwined with lessons of trust. Engineers, medics, and soldiers continued their work systematically. Each neighborhood became a case study in effective humanitarian logistics under military control. The act of offering water, a simple, tangible commodity, revealed deeper truths about modern warfare. Power could be exercised without brutality, authority could be demonstrated through care, and psychological victory could coexist with physical control. The water, unremarkable in appearance, carried unprecedented symbolic weight. By the end of September, the cumulative impact was clear. Neighborhoods stabilized. Women reported fewer sick children. Lines at water points shortened as systems improved. The simple act of clean water distribution had transformed fear into cautious confidence. In districts previously defined by scarcity, distrust, and exhaustion, life began to regain rhythm. This turning point, subtle yet decisive, laid the foundation for the broader stabilization of Japan under Allied occupation. The human, logistical, and moral dimensions intersected here, preparing the ground for the consequences that would follow. With basic survival secured, attention could shift to the broader societal, infrastructural, and psychological aftermath of defeat. By October 1945, the immediate effects of systematic water distribution were evident across Japan's urban centers. In Tokyo, reports from U.S. Army Civil Affairs units noted that previously overcrowded shelters saw a reduction in waterborne illnesses. Cholera and dysentery cases, which had surged in August and September, began to stabilize. Mortality among infants and the elderly decreased measurably, and hospital wards once overflowing with dehydrated patients were able to function more efficiently. Clean water was no longer a sporadic commodity. It had become a predictable resource that could be incorporated into daily routines. For Japanese women, the impact extended beyond health. Households began to regain a sense of rhythm. Cooking, cleaning, and caregiving tasks, which had previously demanded improvisation under extreme scarcity, became manageable. Women could ration water strategically, ensuring that children and the sick received priority. This new stability allowed them to focus on broader domestic responsibilities, including salvaging possessions, preparing food, and supporting extended family members. Observers noted that morale improved where water access was reliable, an indicator that survival and psychological stability were closely intertwined. American reports emphasized the role of women as central figures in the restoration of order. The occupation forces recognized that women's acceptance and cooperation were essential to implementing broader public health measures. Many women acted as informal intermediaries, helping neighbors understand distribution protocols and ensuring compliance with hygiene guidelines. This cooperation not only enhanced efficiency but also helped build trust between civilians and occupation forces. The psychological effects of the water distributions were profound. Women who had anticipated hostility and violence found themselves confronted with an unfamiliar reality. Their survival needs were being met without fear or coercion. The shock of witnessing mercy from a former enemy reinforced a subtle but significant shift in perception. Defeat, previously synonymous with humiliation and suffering, now included the possibility of safety and care. Children observed this dynamic as well, learning that the occupying forces could be sources of protection rather than immediate threat. In addition, the visibility of organized water distribution helped establish the authority of occupation forces in a nonviolent manner. Soldiers, engineers, and medics moved systematically through neighborhoods, maintaining order and providing access. The structured approach reduced the potential for chaos, theft, or panic, which had been major concerns in the early weeks after surrender. By establishing predictable routines, the American forces minimized civil unrest and created the conditions necessary for subsequent relief efforts, including food distribution and medical care. These initial successes also had a symbolic dimension. Water, a fundamental resource, became a tangible representation of American control exercised with restraint. It conveyed that victory did not necessitate cruelty, that power could coexist with moral responsibility, and that the occupier's presence could be integrated into daily life without fear. For Japanese women, who carried the burden of family survival, this symbolism was understood viscerally. Their shock at the Americans' disciplined and humane approach would be recorded in reports, letters, and oral histories, highlighting a rarely examined aspect of the occupation: the intersection of humanitarian aid and military authority. As 1945 progressed into early 1946, the consequences of the American occupation's water distribution extended far beyond immediate health improvements. Once basic survival needs were met, attention shifted to rebuilding infrastructure, restoring civic order, and stabilizing society. Clean water had become the linchpin of recovery, enabling other humanitarian efforts to take root. Schools reopened gradually, hospitals regained function, and families could engage in limited economic activity. Women, who had once carried the full weight of domestic survival, began to organize communal support networks, leveraging the predictable access to water as a foundation for broader recovery initiatives. The psychological transformation among Japanese women was particularly notable. Reports from civil affairs and occupation historians emphasized that women, often the first point of contact for relief, were essential mediators of trust. Their cautious acceptance of American aid signaled to communities that the occupying forces were not immediate threats, allowing entire neighborhoods to adjust to a new social order. Observers recorded that women frequently explained distribution procedures to neighbors, helped maintain queues, and ensured hygiene protocols were followed. In essence, the women became both recipients and enablers of occupation governance. Long-term public health outcomes were significant. By mid-1946, epidemic outbreaks that had threatened post-war urban populations were largely avoided in districts with established water systems. Chlorination and mobile purification units, maintained by occupation engineers, ensured that even makeshift schools, shelters, and hospitals had reliable water access. Mortality rates from previously rampant diseases stabilized, and the incidence of dehydration among vulnerable populations decreased. Scholars of the occupation later credited these interventions as a critical factor in reducing post-war civilian casualties, particularly among women and children who had borne the brunt of wartime deprivation. The broader societal implications were equally profound. The methodical, disciplined, and humane approach of the American forces created a model of governance that emphasized order through assistance rather than coercion. Women observed and internalized these behaviors, contributing to a gradual reshaping of community norms. Reports indicate that where women were active participants in facilitating water distribution, compliance with broader occupation policies was higher, including curfews, sanitation practices, and later participation in food rationing and education programs. The occupation's success, in part, depended upon this subtle partnership between civilian women and military authorities. The water itself became emblematic of the occupation's dual nature, a demonstration of power exercised responsibly and a tangible tool for stabilizing society. Its distribution reshaped daily life, altered perceptions of authority, and provided a foundation for post-war recovery. Japanese women, who had lived through years of scarcity, fear, and uncertainty, began to see that survival could coexist with dignity. The lessons they observed, trust earned through action, authority paired with restraint, would resonate for decades, influencing community dynamics, civil participation, and the early reconstruction of Japanese urban life. In the wake of these operations, Japan's transformation from a devastated wartime society to a stable occupied nation was underway. The careful orchestration of survival necessities, beginning with water, had demonstrated that measured, humane occupation could achieve both control and cooperation. It was a quiet but decisive shift, one whose effects extended from the immediate health of civilians to the long-term psychological and social structure of post-war Japan. The simple act of offering clean water revealed more than military efficiency. It revealed the human dimension of victory. In the scorched streets of Japan, amid rubble and silence, women who had endured years of deprivation encountered an unexpected truth. Survival could be delivered without humiliation, authority could coexist with mercy, and the aftermath of defeat could include dignity. Water, so ordinary in peacetime, became a symbol of control exercised responsibly. It shaped daily routines, stabilized communities, and created trust where fear had dominated for years. For Japanese civilian women, the sight of clear water in a metal bucket was more than relief. It was proof that life could continue, that care could follow conquest, and that the actions of the victorious need not inflict suffering. This moment also reflected a broader lesson about modern warfare. Victory is often measured in territory and casualties, but its lasting impact depends on the treatment of civilians, the preservation of life, and the cultivation of order through humane means. The American occupation in Japan, beginning with acts as simple as clean water distribution, demonstrated that strength can be communicated quietly, through infrastructure and consistency, rather than through intimidation or force. For history, it is a reminder that wars do not end with surrender alone. They end with reconstruction, with trust, and with the decisions that follow the last shot. And for humanity, the lesson is enduring. Even in the shadow of destruction, compassion, when paired with discipline, can transform fear into hope, scarcity into stability, and despair into the possibility of life renewed. In the end, a cup of water, offered calmly, changed everything.